Okay, so hello again, and welcome to the second instructional video on Maya. So we've already introduced the user interface and everything, which is great. You guys kind of have an idea of where everything is, which is good. But now let's talk about how to actually use the software and some of the main hotkeys that you should know when you're working in Maya. So the first hotkey I want you to know, and please honestly take notes, write these things down. I always find that a good mixture of taking notes down and referencing those notes and actually doing stuff in Maya, so a mixture of those two things. So doing it and looking at the notes is like the best way to remember how to do things. So okay, first key, the Alt key. Okay, so if I hold the Alt key, all right, and immediately I can left click. I can do a bunch of different things, but if I left click and hold, just rotate around. Okay. In fact, you know what? I'll create a cube. Just going to create a polycube. Okay, so here's a cube. And if I hit the Alt key and I left click, I can tumble around this object. Okay? Can tumble around the object. Right? And if I keep holding the Alt key and I hold middle mouse and drag, I can pan. So panning is kind of like taking your hand and moving from side to side, or like if you're like a, I don't know, some person floating in space, you can kind of move up, down, left, and right. Okay, can pan. And if I hold the Alt key as well and right click and drag, I can zoom. Okay, so recap, hold the Alt key, left click is rotate, so I can rotate around an object. Okay, I can middle mouse drag to pan, so I can move right, I can move left, I can move up, I can move down. And right click is zoom. Okay, so I can zoom in and out. Okay. And if I'm in my 4 views, okay, if I come down here, I can middle mouse drag and pan. You can't rotate in an orthographic view. This is what you call an orthographic view. So orthographic meaning straight on from the side, from the front, from the top. Okay. So I can pan in an orthographic view, and I can zoom in and out, but I cannot tumble. Okay. I can tumble in the perspective view, but I can't tumble in one of these. Okay. So let's just go back to this viewport here. Okay, so the Alt key. Alt key in combination with the left click is rotate or tumble. In combination with middle mouse drag is pan, excuse me. And in combination with right click is zoom in and out. Okay, so the Alt key. Just remember that. Super important. Best friend. It is your best friend. The Alt key, get to know it, love it, cherish it, hold it. Find a special place for it in your heart. It's a wonderful, wonderful key. Okay, so the Alt key. Second key I want you to learn is the space bar. Now, there's a trick to this. The The spacebar can be used in two ways. It can be used to access the HUD, or the heads-up display, which we'll get into in a minute, or it can be used to toggle viewport maximization. So what I mean by viewport maximization is if I simply have my cursor over a viewport and I tap the spacebar, you can see that it brings me to either 4 views, or if I have my cursor over the perspective view and I tap the spacebar, it will maximize that viewport, that given viewport. So any viewport that I have my cursor over, it will maximize the viewport when I tap the spacebar. So let's say I want to maximize the top view. Put my cursor over here, tap, and tap again to come out. Down here, in front view, tap. Side view, tap, tap. Perspective, tap. Okay, so maximizing, you know, your viewport can be great because it gives you. I like to work this way. This is kind of how I like to work because it's bigger. You know, gives you more kind of real estate almost to work with. Okay. So it's a good idea to, you know, maybe create an object for yourself and just tumble around. You know, tumble around, zoom in and out, pan around a bit. Just get a feel for how to navigate in your viewports with Maya. You know, because if you can't navigate, navigation is key. Because if you can't navigate, you're working blind. Okay, so really learn navigation. So the Alt key, left click, rotate around, middle mouse drag. Okay, just to recap those, and the space bar. Okay, I can maximize any viewport if I just put my cursor over there. Okay. So those are the first 2 keys I want you to learn. Alt key and the space bar. The third key I'd like you to learn is the F key. Okay, and the F key means focus. Simple enough, right? So let's say I take this cube. I'm just going to duplicate it, bring it over here. So I have 2 cubes on my screen, right? Simple enough. But let's say I want to focus on one of these objects. Okay, because if I tumble around now, it's just tumbling arbitrarily. So if I come over here, you know, I can see that it's tumbling from the center of the viewport. Okay. But if I want to tumble around a particular object, well, it's easy to do. I can click here on this object and I can say F. And that will focus the viewport on this object. So now I can actually tumble around it. So that makes sense. Right? Same goes for the other object. Select it, hit F, and it will focus in on that object. Okay. And the same can be said for working in the components of an object. Now we'll get into the components of components of objects in a second, but just to keep in the back of your brain, if I'm in an object component, so if I'm working with points or what we call vertices, I can hit F to focus in on a single point. If I'm working in edges, and again I'll explain what these are in just a minute, I can focus in on a particular edge of an object. And if I'm working in faces, switch back to shaded mode, select this face, and I can focus in on that face. So by using the F key, we can focus in on any object or an object's components. So that's really handy. Okay. And again, we'll get into components of an object when we start modeling our first object, our cup, or you could call it a tankard, beer mug, whatever, silver beer mug. And we'll get into components. But the next key I want you to learn, or rather I should say, hotkeys are your transform shortcut keys. So we discussed in the last video what transforms are. They are moves, or a move in space when an object moves in space, a rotation, or a scaling of an object in space. So we kind of described, the buttons that do that. So if I have an object selected here, I can move, I can rotate, and I can scale by selecting these buttons. But if you're fumbling around with these buttons, really it can get kind of slow. Okay, because you got to come up here, select it, fiddle around with that, and then you know, come over here. Well, the best way to do this is by using the shortcut keys. Really, it's a much more efficient way to work. This is a very industry standard way to work, and you should know them like the back of your hand. So the shortcut keys for select, move, rotate, and scale are Q, W, E, and R. So if I hit the Q key, okay, well, select is already selected, so. But if you notice, if I hit the Q, so let's go to the move tool. So if I hit the Q key, you'll notice up here, okay, you'll notice up here when I hit the Q key, that automatically I have selected the select tool. So I can come in and select things. If I hit the W key, I'm now in the move tool, and I can move things around. If I hit the E key, I can rotate, and if I hit the R key, I can scale. Okay, so I generally like to keep my left hand freed up to hit my hotkeys, and where I generally rest my left hand fingers are in and around the Q, W, E, and R keys. So I'll keep my fingers on those keys and my thumb on. I'll usually kind of alternate between the Alt key and the space bar with my thumb. So if I need to rotate, I can just kind of take my thumb and bring it over to the Alt key. I can use my index finger to hit the F key, to tap the F key to focus in on something. Okay, and I can tap the space bar whenever I need to switch between viewports. Okay. All right. So, just to recap, Q brings me to my cursor where I can just select, or my selection tool, we'll call it, to be formal. So Q, okay, I can select objects. W allows me to select and move objects. E allows me to select and rotate objects. Okay, so I can select any object and rotate it. And scale allows me to select and scale any object. Okay. So Q, W, E, and R. And again, I'll sort of reiterate the importance of taking notes. Really just mess around with it though. I mean, that's the best way to do it. Take notes. Look at your notes if you need to, but I think messing around with the software and just working in the software is the best way to work. Best way to memorize anything, any workflow, any hotkey. Okay, so now moving back one step, we were talking about the space bar, and I showed you how to use the space bar to toggle between viewports. Okay, but the space bar also is your second best friend to the Alt key because it allows you to access the HUD. So what is the HUD? HUD stands for Heads Up Display, and what it does is it actually encompasses, it's kind of like a user interface that encompasses the entire Maya toolset in one handy dandy heads up display. So if I hold the spacebar down, it brings up my heads up display. And if you notice, if I put my cursor anywhere on the screen, that is where the heads up display will show itself. So if I put my cursor over here, and I hold down the space bar, it's going to show the heads-up display over there, where the cursor is. If I bring it over here and I hold the space bar, you can see the heads-up display comes up over here. Simple enough, right? But the nice thing about the heads-up display is I can access any tool in Maya. Any tool. Okay, and that's kind of what I was talking about when we went through the user interface before in the first video of Maya, when I was explaining, the main menu bar. I was explaining that I don't generally tend to use it, and the reason is because I always refer back to the heads-up display. I always come to the heads-up display, and I can save objects here. I can edit objects, I can create objects, I can select objects, modify objects, anything I want just in here. So it's a really organic way of working, if you will, rather than coming up here and fiddling and fussing with all these buttons. And some of these buttons do have a use, and I do use them, but not all the time. I generally stick to the heads-up display. Okay. So a spacebar. Okay. Two functions. So I probably should have started with that anyhow, before moving on to the F key. But anyway, yeah, spacebar. We can toggle between viewports. We can also access the heads-up display with holding the key down, and it shows you all these handy-dandy tools that Maya has, which is pretty much everything that Maya has in one nice, concise menu set, which is great. Okay, so that's the second function of the spacebar. Just make a note of that. Really, really important. Okay. So we went through the Alt key. We know we can rotate around and navigate using the Alt key plus mouse functions. Okay. We know what the spacebar does. We can toggle between viewports. And we can also bring up the heads-up display, which gives us all of Maya's tools in one handy-dandy menu set. So now, we also know what the F key does. It means focus. So I can select objects, and I can hit F to focus in on them. And after which I can tumble around and use my Alt key. Okay. But now let's talk about how to undo. So in most softwares, Control Z or Control Z is usually how you undo commands. In Maya, you can just hit the Z button or the Z button. You don't have to use Control Z. Nothing bad happens when you hit Control Z. If you prefer Control Z, that's fine. I can select something and say Control Z to deselect it, and I can also select something and say Z, and it'll do the same thing. It's fine. But yeah, so if you perform a command of some kind, you move a vertice here, and you say, wait, I don't want to do that. Well, you just hit the Z key a couple of times, and it'll take you back. Okay. Now, how about if we want to hide objects? So if I have an object, I don't want to view it anymore. Now let me just bring up my outliner before I do this so that I can see these objects in the scene. So I have a PQ1, PQ2. So what if I want to hide one of these objects? Well, I can do that in a couple of ways. I can grab them from the outliner and say Control H. Okay. Or I can select them in the viewport and say Control H as well. Okay. And if I want to bring them back, all I got to do is come up here and select any object and just hit Shift H. Okay. So I'll hold down the Shift key and H. Okay. Pretty simple. So that's why I brought up my outliner, because I wanted to, if I hide something, well, I can't select it to bring it back anymore, can I? So I can come into my outliner and I can say Shift H and unhide it. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why having the outliner open is kind of nice. So we can go into how to find the outliner in a little bit, and we're going to do that. I'm going to show you guys how to open up the main windows that you want to have open when you're modeling, when we start modeling our cup. But we're just going to focus on some of the main hotkeys right now. So we just covered the Control H functions and Shift H functions to hide and unhide. So that's nice. We know how to hide objects, we know how to rotate, we know how to maximize and minimize viewports, and we know how to access the HUD, which is good. So we can come in and you know, do any commands that we need to, find any tools that we need to, and we can also navigate now. We know how to navigate, we know how to focus in on things, and we know how to hide and unhide objects. Okay, so we're rocking and rolling. We're looking good. So now let's talk about some of the snapping functions in Maya. Now snapping, if none of you have heard the term, snapping means to take one object and put it directly over another object, or place it one point of an object to another point of an object. So a good way to demonstrate that is, let's say I have my cube, and I want to snap my cube, the pivot of my cube, to, I don't know, maybe a point of this cube over here. So what we call a vertice. So vertex snap, so if I wanted to take the pivot of this and snap it there to, let's say, the corner of this cube, I hold down the V key and I middle mouse drag, so middle mouse drag right to this corner. And you can see that it automatically just snaps to the nearest vertex that is in the scene. So we're going to talk about vertexes in a little bit. I know you don't know what a vertex is right now. It's basically a point on an object, so, or a point in space, but it's usually a point on a mesh. And if I hold the V key again and I middle mouse and drag with this object selected maybe to another point, it'll snap to that point. So you can see that I can take the pivot of any object and snap it to a vertice or a vertex. And a vertex is just a point on an object, on a 3D mesh. Okay? And we're going to get into explaining what components are in a little bit. But right now, just know that V is vertex snap. Okay? So just to demonstrate, I could show you. Go to vertex, and if I hit the 4 key, I can show you that that is a point. We have this little point, this nice point right here, and that's what a vertex is. So I can snap to any of these points. Okay, just to be clear on that. So now what if I wanted to maybe snap an object to a grid point or a grid intersection? So here you can see I have my grid, and if I hold the X key, so that's the X key, and I middle mouse and drag to any point on the grid, it will snap to a grid. And again, it's using the object's pivot, so wherever the pivot is placed is where it's going to snap to. Okay, so I can snap to a grid. And what if I want to, let's say, snap an object's pivot to a curve? Okay, well, I need a curve to be able to do that. So if I come in, and where are we? Curves. So if I come in and I say I want to create a curve. So create, and we're going to say curve tools, CV curve tool. So I'll create a CV curve by just clicking a few points on my viewport, and I'll hit enter. And what I can do is I can grab one of these cubes and I can middle mouse drag. Let's just middle mouse drag over here so we can see the cube is kind of down there. It's kind of far away, but that's okay. If I hold the C key and snap, sometimes it takes a second. So see, I've snapped, I've held the C key and I've middle mouse dragged, and it snaps the cube's pivot right to the curve. And while holding the C key, if I middle mouse drag and sort of slide along, it slides right along that curve. So that's kind of nice. Okay, so snap to curve. All right. So V is vertex snap. So when I want to snap to, so if I hold the V key, I can snap to any one of these intersecting points. So a point there, a point there, and a point there. If I want to snap to the grid, I hold the X key and it snaps down to the grid. And the same could be said if, oh, pardon me, if I wanted to snap in the side view here, I hold the X key, I can snap the cube to any one of these grid points. Okay. And then if I go back up here, and again the C key, if I hold C and I middle mouse drag right to that end point of that curve, so right there. Sometimes it takes a second to get it to work, but curve snap. Okay. So those are the 3 snapping keys, and they're really important when you're modeling an object, because sometimes you'll have, you know, one part of an object and you'll say, hey, I want this part of the object to be perfectly aligned, you know, with the other part with another part of this object, whether at a point or an edge or a face. You know, you can align things that way in a much easier fashion by using some of your snapping functions. Okay, so the next hotkey I want you to know, or I should say hotkey combination, is Control A. And Control A, I think we went through this in the last video, but Control A toggles your between your channel box editor and your attribute editor. So this is really important because sometimes you'll have an object selected and you'll say, hey, I need an attribute on that object. I need to figure out, you know, who it got drunk with last night and who it slept with, what it ate for breakfast, whatnot. So if I have an object selected, so say it's this cube, okay, so if I select this cube and I say Control A, I can toggle, with this object selected, I can toggle between the attribute editor, which gives me, you know, all of its information, the render stats, displacement maps, smooth mesh, tangent space, mesh controls, all this nice stuff. And if I say Control A again, it takes me back to my channels, so my transform channels. And we know what transforms are at this point. It's basically if something moves in space, it records its point in space, it records its rotational information, and also its scale. So if I set the scale, an object, we remember when you create something, it always comes back to 1. I'll just set it to 1. So Control A. Okay, so if I select any object, it gives me lots of information on the object. It gives me its history, all that good stuff, and also It allows me to turn off the render stats. If I want to open the attribute editor, um, I can say, okay, I want the primary visibility to be on or off. I want it to receive shadows, cast shadows, whatnot, here, there, all that stuff. Okay. So Control A. So you can see when I hit Control A, hold Control, hit the A button, I'm toggling between those. Okay. Really important. And I'm showing you these particular hotkeys. There are other hotkeys in Maya, but I'm showing you these particular ones because they're the most important for what we're going to be doing, which is modeling and some texturing and you know, for the most part, manipulating objects in space and getting them to do what we want them to do and getting them to look how we want them to look. Okay. So Control A, really important. And the next two buttons that I want you to learn are, and I think we're going to stop after these two buttons because I think we'll leave other buttons for later exercises. But the next two, just so that you have a good foundation of hotkeys for modeling exercises. The next two I want you to learn, and the last two that you're going to learn, are the 4 and 5 keys. So the 4 and 5 keys basically just toggle between shaded and wireframe mode. So this is really handy and quite important actually, because you know, like when you're modeling an object, sometimes you kind of want to view things in wireframe. You know, you can focus in on it and you say, okay, well, I need to see a vertex, I need to see a point, so I can't see it right now because it's hidden by this stupid surface. So you know, you kind of want to just view the object like glass so that you get a better understanding of its form and shape. Really simply, you just hit the 4 key, okay, and it'll switch to wireframe mode. If I hit the 5 key, it'll toggle back to shaded mode. So this is really important when you're modeling anything. You kind of do this. You know, you flip between the two, and it really gives you a better understanding of just, like, you know, that form of the object. And then you can imagine if you're modeling a really complicated character, and you want something to be just a little more clear to you. Sometimes, I mean, I've had characters where, you know, you'll have so many edge loops. I mean, I could just demonstrate, you know, just with this. I could just add a whole bunch of edge loops, and you're kind of going like, holy but Jesus, like, this is just insane. Like, I don't understand this. So it's like, well, I don't know what this means. So if I'm working with a character that's got all these edge loops in it, and I want to select something here, but I can't tell what's what, I'll just hit the 5 key. Okay. And all of a sudden it's go, oh, there's my vert. Okay, I'll grab that, pull it out or whatnot. Okay. So the 4 and the 5 key, really important. And again, there's other hotkeys that you are going to learn in this course, but we're gonna you know, cover those in the next lesson, which is going to be our first exercise of modeling a cup. Where we're going to be talking a little bit about subdivision surfaces and what they do, because it's really important to understand, you know, how an object solves in 3D when you put smoothing on it. And that's what subdivision surfaces is essentially smoothing of an object. So we're going to talk about how to work in sub-Ds and how to make something look good and how to manipulate an object to make it the surface solve the way you want it to. Solve just means make it look the way you want it to. Okay? All right. So we've covered, just to recap, we have covered the Alt key. So if we select an object and we hold the Alt key and left click, we can rotate around. If we middle mouse drag, we can pan with the Alt key. With the Alt key, if we hold the right mouse button, we can zoom like that. Okay. And second, we have the space bar. So if I tap the space bar, I can toggle between viewports. Okay. And if I hold the space bar, it gives me my heads-up display where I can access all of Maya's tools. Okay. And then we add the F key, which was focus. So I can, with any object selected, I can focus in on that object in any viewport. So F, select this, F, focus. I can select this curve and say F, focus. Okay. And then we had hiding and showing objects. So again, I'll open up my outliner just to be clear about it. If I select this curve and say Control H, it'll hide the curve. And if I want to bring it back, I'll just come over to my outliner, select the curve, say Shift H, and unhide it. So Control H to hide, Shift H to unhide. And then excuse me, and then we had the transform shortcut keys, which were Q, W, E, and R. So if I hit the Q key, I can select things, but not do anything to them really. I can hit the W key to move it, whatever I've selected. I can then hit the E key to rotate it, and I can hit the R key to scale it. And then we had the snapping functions. V to snap to point or vertice. So if I have the move tool selected and I want to move that object's pivot to a point or a vertex, I can hold the V key and snap it to that point. So if I zoom in, or a better way to illustrate this is to use this cube. So I have this cube's pivot. I want to snap it to this point. I can snap it to that point. Snap it to this point. Snap it to this point. We might even call them corners. V key. Okay. So the V key snaps to points. And if I want to snap to a grid, so I'll bring my grid back here. If I want to snap to a grid, I can hold the X key and snap to any point on the grid. Okay. And the C key snaps to curves. So if I have this end point on a curve and I have the move tool selected, I can say hold the C key down, middle mouse drag, and it will snap, or should snap, to the curve. And there it goes. Snap to the curve. Hit my F key to focus maybe. Snap to curve. And again, I'm middle mouse dragging here. Now, once you have something moved to a line or a curve, you've snapped to a curve, you don't have to middle mouse drag anymore. You can just left click and drag or whatever. Okay. And then, what's the other button? Oh yeah, we had Control A. Okay, so if I have an object selected, Control A toggles between my channel box editor, which gives me all of my transform information and my history and my display layers. And if I hit Control A, it gives me my attribute editor where I can come into mesh controls, mesh component display, and I can say, you know, hard edge color, standard, lots of fun stuff in there. I can go into my render stats, say cast shadows, receive shadows, motion blur, primary visibility, and then I can enable or disable any of these render stats. Okay. So that's Control A. And then we had the undo button, which was Z. Okay, so if I do something, say I move a cube here and I don't like where I moved it, I can hit Z. Okay, or Z, depending on whether you're American or not. Okay, so, and I think last but not least, we had the 4 and 5 keys, which toggle between wireframe and shaded mode. So wireframe, shaded, wireframe, shaded. Okay. F to focus, wireframe, shaded, wireframe, shaded. All right. Okay, so those are pretty much the main hotkeys I want you guys to know for now. In the next video, we are going to be starting to model a tankard, a silver tankard. So we're going to have lots of fun. We're going to discuss the components of an object, so what makes a 3D mesh, and then we're also going to do a quick demonstration of how subdivision surfaces work so that we can, you know, work with smooth bodied objects. Okay, all of that in the next video, and I will see you then.